Yeah, let's do it. And if we've got stragglers, I'm not going to say anything interesting anyway. So I hope I say something interesting.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Maggie Grabmeyer. I'm an adult services librarian at the Mill Valley Public Library. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program with Nico Lang and Britta Stromeyer. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the occupied territory of the Coast Miwok people. Today, on Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as every day, I'd like to express gratitude for the Coast Miwok people and encourage you all to find out how to get involved and learn more about the Indigenous people in Marin County by checking out coastmiwokofmarin.com. I also want to thank all the community partners who helped make this event possible. Thanks to the Mill Valley School District and Mill Valley Middle School for hosting us. And thank you to It Takes a Village, Mill Valley Special Education PTA, and the Mill Valley Public Library. I also want to shout out our community bookseller, the Depot Bookstore in the back. After the program, they will be selling books, and Nico and Britta will have time for a brief signing, so we hope you'll consider buying some books. Nico Lang is a non-binary, award-winning journalist.
Please don't read the whole thing.
I'll just read a couple sentences.
Okay, thank you.
With over a decade of experience covering the transgender community's fight for equality. Their work has appeared in major publications, including Rolling Stone, Esquire, the New York Times, and more. And hopefully we'll get a little bit more into their bio soon. Their new book, American Teenager, How Trans Kids Are Surviving Hate and Finding Joy in a Turbulent Era. Nico spent a year traveling the country to document the lives of transgender, non-binary, and gender-fluid teens and their families to share these firsthand perspectives on what it's like growing up trans in America today. Tonight, Nico is joined by Britta Stromeyer, author of award-winning children's books. Her writing appears in Flash Fiction Magazine, Bending Genres Journal, On the Seawall, Necessary Fiction, Marin Independent Journal, and more. She was a finalist for the Bellingham Review Tobias Fourth Award for Fiction. She's a book critic with the National Book Critics Circle, SF Writers Grotto, Authors Against Book Bans, and PEN. She teaches creative writing and is a parent in this community. So please join me in welcoming Nico Lang and Britta Stromeyer.
Thank you, Maggie, so much. This is a lovely introduction, by the way. I want to also give a couple of shout outs. Thank you, Elizabeth Kaufman, who is the superintendent of this district and was a very early champion of this event. I also would like to thank the library and It Takes a Village. Tammy was working tirelessly behind the scenes logistically, and Mill Valley Special Education PTA and Depot. Thank you for coming out. And also providing some refreshments and cookies, which are always welcome. And a very warm welcome to Nico Lang. I'm so excited to be here with you after all these months of behind the scenes conversations and finally being here with you. But before we get started, I'm just curious who's in the audience. Has anybody read the book? I know it's only a week old, but anybody read the book yet? No. Just me. Just a show of hands, I'm just curious, who in the audience has a close family member or friend that is trans? Just quick show of hands so we know who is in the audience. Thank you. And for those of you who may not or may not have a family member, or just in general, I'm just curious, how familiar are you with the issues of transgender youth, and in particular and the challenges they have? Like, I'm an expert. Any experts? No. They're like, I think I kind of know what's going on. No, sort of. Okay. So I thought it was kind of interesting to know that. Also, quick disclaimer, I am from a generation that grew up in a very binary world. I do try to ask pronouns and try to do my best to get them correct. I don't always, so if I make a mistake, I hope you will correct me. I don't mean to misgender or offend anybody.
I'll throw an M&M at her every time she does it.
Okay, I'll take that.
Write them out.
And I don't know if you know that, but you and I have actually something in common. Our books do.
What's that?
Both of our books were blurbed by Maya Kobe and Jazz Jennings.
Oh, I love that.
Yes.
I was copying you, actually.
Oh, is that right? Okay. And Maya said about your book that you show trans teenagers as they really are, kids trying their best day by day to grow into their truest self and fullest potential. And Jazz Jennings said about your book, As a transgender woman who transitioned during childhood, American Teenager resonates deeply with me. With heartfelt empathy, Nico Lang uncovers the human stories overshadowed by political rhetoric, showcasing the struggles and resilience of transgender youth amid adversity, while also amplifying their voices, which are all too often silenced. And speaking of, I want to add a couple more praises because you wouldn't let us read your whole bio, so there you go.
It's because it's embarrassing.
Well, get used to it. Executive Director of the National Center of Transgender Equality, and I'm going to butcher that name. Rodrigo Hang Ledner, is that how you pronounce it?
You got the first two, right?
Okay.
It's like Lent, oh my God, now I'm butchering it. It's like Lenten.
I just want to make sure I said it right.
Yeah, we're doing our
I
best.
basically said about your book that it's an evocative and authentic story of love and resilience, that your storytelling is intimate and illuminating. You're walking a tightrope between the complex narratives of trauma and joy. An American Teenager, an absolute must read. And I could not disagree more. Agree more with that.
So this is a debate.
That's
Yeah.
okay, yeah, so we're getting into the political now. But these are people that, are, kind of expert in the field, so to speak, but I also want to share a couple because we do have parents in this audience. A couple of reactions to your book, and this is from Amanda, a mother of a trans teen, said, reading about these families made me feel less alone. Chelsea said, I cried tears of joy, tears of sorrow, tears of dismay, but mainly tears of hope. I second that, I cried as well. And Danielle said, I saw myself in our family story in so many of these stories. I learned things about my own children through reading other stories. So I'm so excited to talk about this book, but before we do, I was hoping you would read a little excerpt for us.
Sure.
All right,
I
I'm gonna hand the mic to you so people
Yes,
can
let
hear
me
you.
find the excerpt first. So, okay, I'm gonna change it up on you and I'm so sorry.
I knew you were gonna do that. Who was I just talking to about this?
It's
That's fine.
It's because I feel like, and I'll tell you why afterward, I'm gonna keep you all in suspense a little bit. You're gonna be like, why the heck are we talking about this? But I feel like it's kind of in my opinion, it's like the nugget of the whole project, right? So in order to understand what I'm doing, you have to understand Kierkegaard. So we're gonna talk about Kierkegaard. Okay, so as a little bit of groundwork here. So this comes in the 6th chapter, the second to last. It's about two trans siblings in Florida who have been forced to survive the increasingly hostile political environment there. One of the siblings is Jack. She was 19 at the time. Yes, sometimes these kids with the ages, I'm like, they keep getting older and it's confusing. And then, so Jack, 19-year-old trans girl, and her sibling Augie, who is 17 years old, no, 16, and non-binary. I told you kid ages, so confusing. But like, they both struggled with this in really different ways. Because August, as a non-binary person, struggled with the fact that no one ever saw them for themselves the way they wanted to be seen. Like they would go to the grocery store and just no one ever genders them correctly because it's just really difficult to present yourself as like, oh, I would like to be referred to by they, them pronouns without just telling, people that all the time, right? How do you project that in your dress and your manner? There's not an easy way to do that as a non-binary person. I get that, it's just not, it's not an easy thing to do. And with Jack, her struggle was that her state took away her medical care. For 5 months, she was forcibly detransitioned by the state after her gender-affirming medical care was revoked through Medicaid coverage. So her estrogen that she relied on to be herself and to live her life in accordance with the way she wanted to be in the world was gone. And she would sit in the dark all day in case she caught like a glimpse of her arm or just saw a part of her body that she didn't want to see and didn't want to see changing. She stopped eating. And she got so skinny that her mom worried that she might die in her sleep. So she would sit by her every night while her daughter fell asleep. And I went down there for 2.5 weeks to kind of minister to them in a way, right? Because it was like a weird kind of ministry during this book. And we talked about everything they'd been through, everything they'd experienced. And this scene takes place on the balcony as Jack and I are just talking about her life and the future, or her future, and what the world means to her now after everything that she's been through. Okay. As the week carves out its natural trajectory, the apartment blooms with charming decay from the private collection of June, that's Simon Jackson, who never met trash that she couldn't repurpose as custom luxury. Below the newly hung wooden signs reading, "Grow what you go through," and "Our home" is a kitchen candle that was once a bottle of sake in its former life. On the balcony is a convocation of corroded effects, a peeling green bench, a rusted metal shelf that looks like it was left out in the rain, and a black filing cabinet that screeches when anyone tries to pull open its laggard drawers. Secondhand tchotchkes far outnumber the apartment's human residents, such as a ceramic cat with a pin-cushioned derriere and the genetically improbable combination of a rabbit father and pig wife holding a felt bunny infant. June believes these earnest touches are a sign that after years of wrong turns, of feeling lost in her own life, she's headed in the right direction at last. Even if those predictions are a tad premature, she's determined to will them into coming true. Mom's back, she announces to her children, who are so dazed after a week of reacclimating that they barely even register her presence in the room. She's feeling better. Jack tells me that she knows she's reached a new chapter of her life when the air feels different and everything suddenly has a new smell, the kind that comes from opening the windows and allowing the breeze to cleanse a musty house. Their situation may be imperfect, but Jack takes comfort in having her own space, somewhere to analyze the work of ponderous existential philosophers in relative peace. She has been reading Fear and Trembling, a foundational study of moral philosophy authored by the 19th century Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard. Some scholars now believe that the text was an attempt to work through Kierkegaard's then recent uncoupling from his muse and fiancée, Regina Olsen. In Genesis, the Bible tells of God's demand that Abraham sacrifice his son Isaac, a commandment that is then abandoned at the actual moment of bloodshed. If an all-knowing, all-powerful God personally wills such beastly acts, or in its metatextual reading, allows Kierkegaard to have his heart broken, Fear and Trembling posits that believing in the heavenly divine requires a temporary suspension of ethics. God, he argues, must operate on an entirely different moral plane than the rest of us, one that we simply cannot understand. While Jack is not a Christian, reading the thin volume as she lies in her bed allows her to ponder a related set of questions. What world is this that operates along such blurry ethical lines? How can this be what life is? Unfortunately, Jack knows that she will never know why things happen as they do, why these are the burdens that she was asked to carry, or why some people have so much when others are given so little. As we go for a rare walk around her apartment complex, Jack tells me that it feels like she's been asleep for 2 years and that she's only now starting to wake up. Her eyes readjusting to the light of the day. She doesn't know what happens now, whether there's anything out there for her. I don't think we arrive on Earth with a purpose, she says. I think that's silly. God isn't sitting you down and saying, you're going to be a contractor. But despite her she's so funny. But despite her lack of belief, whether in the hereafter or humanity itself, there's a part of her that wants the faith that Kierkegaard ultimately chooses for himself, even though he has every reason to abandon a God who stood idle while his heart was shattered. I do not want to exist in a reality where nothing means anything, and when you die, there's no more thinking, Jack says. But it doesn't matter what I want because it's going to happen either way. I don't get to decide, so I'm either going to be at peace with that or let it eat at me for the rest of my life. And the reason that I was very adamant about putting this in the book, that when we were having this conversation, it really did take like 2 hours on the porch to debate this freaking book because it's so dense. I knew in that moment that I was getting to have an experience that was critical to the project of this book because it's the kind of way that trans kids very rarely get to see themselves, right? That trans kids are often represented as only being trans, and that's kind of it. They have like no internal life otherwise and nothing going on outside of that one thing about them. And it is important to know that they're trans because it dictates the way the world sees them. It dictates their rights in a lot of places in the country, in every place in our country. It dictates the way that their friends treat them sometimes, the way their schoolmates treat them. That's important to know, but it's not the only thing. And there are just so many moments in my life that I've never seen depicted in like literature or film before, these like little moments that you get to have, right? Where you're connecting with someone as like another person and you like bond over your like shared humanity. And trans kids very rarely get to do that. They rarely are like given that experience in the ways in which we represent them, even though they have those kinds of experiences all the time. Like they go to the beach, you know, they hang out with their friends, they go to the mall, they watch movies. they do all these things, they have these like very lovely full lives filled with these varied experiences, but we only seem to want to talk about one thing. So it's like when I was watching this girl smoke a cigarette on the balcony talking about Kierkegaard, I was like, there we go. That's what this book is right there. And it's just so, there's just so much in it. And when y'all, I hope, buy this book, please, and read it. I hope you're struck by that it's just so alive. It's so filled with life. It's so filled with these kids' hopes and dreams. It feels like you live 1,000 lifetimes reading this book. And that's sort of exactly what I wanted for them. You're welcome.
I agree with that. So you reading that section, yes, you're throwing off my local line of questioning, but I'm going to bring it back. How did you find these families? How did you go about finding, these particular families and talking to them? And what was it like to go through this experience?
Sure. So a lot of these families I already knew because I've been doing this work for a really long time, despite being very young looking. I have been doing LGBTQ plus journalism for over 10 years now, and then I've been working with families of trans kids for at least 8, kind of depending on how you count. The first story I ever did properly was in Teen Vogue. I talked to a family in Texas who were, later would be at the center of the state's fight to erase the rights and protections for trans kids. And I talked to them shortly after their son came out, and they were sort of a little new to this and a little new to the fight at the time, but we had just this like lovely conversation. We really bonded, I think because I wasn't what they were expecting from a reporter. Like this sounds like a neg, but I swear it's not. Like I'm just not always a very serious person because I have a really hard job. So I don't want to just be like sad and angry all the time. So when I'm not working, like I never watch the news in like my personal life. I want to watch like light comedies. I watch screwball comedies all the time, right? If it's not Barbara Sandwick talking at 200 words a minute, like I'm just not interested, and I think it like gives a sort of balance to my life, but it also means that I bring in a different energy into the room than I think people would expect. And it often puts people at ease. So they just really liked working with me because it felt like they were working with a person rather than this like work robot who's there to ask them 3 questions and leave. So they referred me to all these other parents, and I grew this community really quickly. And I built up this trust really quickly because these parents knew that I would respect them and I would respect their kids. I was going to ask them any weird questions, like one of those like Katie Couric questions about what's going on down there. That's a real thing that happened, unfortunately. And I wasn't going to misgender them. I was going to treat them, their kids, with the love and respect that they deserve. And I got to grow up with so many of these kids. Like I've seen them graduate from high school, go off to college, and it's been such a wonderful thing to get to do. So when I was writing this book, I had those connections in place already. Like I had these communities all across this country, all across the country, these networks. And it meant I just didn't have to do as much of the work there. That it was like, well, I know this family in this state already. I know this family in this state. I know this family in this state. But then on top of that, I knew that there were families that I was looking for and didn't know yet. Like I knew I wanted AAPI stories in this book. Because I just think in like the queer and the trans space, there's of course there's been storytelling before. It's not like I invented it or something. But I just don't think that there's been nearly enough. And I just wanted to personally see more. It was like injecting my own agenda. So like luckily, so I reached out to PFLAG, and they put me in touch with like parent groups who connected me with like other parents. And I found this amazing Muslim Pakistani family in Illinois, and a Japanese Hawaiian family in California. And what I loved about getting to write those stories is I just felt like I related to them so much. Like I related to their families so much. Like the Muslim Pakistani story was so much about like intergenerational trauma and sort of like the trauma that's like passed down from like mothers to daughters and like grandparents to their kids and the ways that they all just like navigate that as a family. And that's so my family's story. So the mom and I were just like constantly hunting all the time about like the way that our parents are. And it felt really cool to just get to bond as people and to tell this really human story. And then in California, that girl, she just reminded me so much of like me when I was 17. Because she lives in the state where she has a lot of protections for herself, and she doesn't have to think about fighting for her rights. She doesn't have to go to the Capitol with her friends to beg lawmakers to be able to exist, right? So because of that, she just gets to be a teenage girl, and she's so teenagery, and she's like bratty, but in a good way, like in this way that she just kind of does what she wants. She's so confident and self-assured. And I just love that because I felt like it was something that trans teens never get, right? That they don't get that in storytelling about their lives because they always have to be perfect and they have to be portrayed as perfect. And it's not that she's like imperfect, she's just human in the way the rest of us are. Because like, raise your hands here if you're perfect, right? Oh, okay, well, we've got one. Okay, we have one perfect person here, bound to be. But for everybody else, you know, it's just the way you live your life, right? But trans kids are denied access to the reality that the way the rest of us live it, and it can be so just dehumanizing. So with this book, I just wanted to center humanity as much as I possibly could. And it felt just really cool to get to work with these particular families. I'm so lucky that I got to know them and be let into their lives. It just feels like it's like I have all these families across the country. Like as a journalist, you're not supposed to be friends with your subjects, but when you're working on a book as just like intimate and as like powerful as this, like it's impossible not to be. Like I'll know forever.
But I think that's what makes that book so relatable and so enjoyable to read as well, because you have that connection with those families and that shines through in your storytelling. I do want to touch on something. One of the undercurrents of the book, despite the joy and the connections that you make, is there's a sense of loneliness and isolation for those teens. And you start actually the story with Wyatt's story, who faces a lot of rejection on multiple fronts. When Wyatt transitioned, half of his family basically broke off contact. Community is scattered in their opinions, but what was really gut-wrenching for me was one of their favorite teachers after Wyatt's transition kept misgendering him. And I was just wondering, can you talk a little bit about that fear of real or perceived, of that otherness that these kids experience on a daily basis, and how in Wyatt's case and maybe some of the other cases, how it can be overcome, and kind of the role that community and school and families play in fostering that feeling of belonging and overcoming that.
Yeah. Great question. It's such a good question that I don't know if I have a good answer for it. So we'll see. I think it can be tough because as kids, you kind of want to be the same as everybody else. At least I did when I was really young. I was like so obsessed when I was like 12 or 13 with being popular. And I wanted to be exactly like the popular kids, and I would do everything that they did. I would like try to watch the movies that they watched, and I would figure out what music they listened to. And all I wanted was just to be like everybody else. And really it was me kind of trying to how do you extinguish my own difference, that I knew I was really different from everybody else and I didn't want to be different. So my mission was to just be exactly the same, as much of a carbon copy clone as it could be. Now, obviously it didn't work. So, but I think you see that with a lot of these kids, that I don't think it's like they want to be the same as all the cis kids, but it can be really hard to stand out in school. Because if you stand out, it's not always in a good way. Like it can make you a target for bullying. It was really fascinating with Wyatt because a lot of the kids there didn't necessarily know that he was trans. Because it's really interesting. You probably see this all the time, like, you know, middle school and elementary school and high school, where there's a certain group of kids who all grow up together in elementary school, but then they go to a bigger middle school where there are more kids. And they go to a bigger high school where there are even more kids. So now that he was in high school, there were all of these high school kids that didn't know Wyatt when he came out, that only know him as the boy that he is now. So they're not privy to that history. And they're not always having that explained to them all the time. So they just might not know, like they just might not be aware. Some kids knew and a lot of kids just didn't because it was a huge high school. But it's fascinating because, and like the bad way, because he was often bullied for being gay because he identifies as trans, but he also identifies as gay. So he wears like black nails and he's like sometimes on the effeminate side, like play with gender presentation sometimes. And he's also just like a sensitive, sweet boy who isn't like cut out for how difficult high school can be and how difficult kids can be sometimes. So it was a lot to navigate constantly. And he didn't always want to go to school because of it. Like when I was there, I feel like most days he was trying to figure out a way to not go to school that day, to not have to face these kids. Because on top of all of that, he just didn't feel like they got him. And he didn't feel like he really understood them. And it's just a lot like that many levels of feeling like an outsider. It's just a lot to deal with. And that I think the belonging that Wyatt wanted manifested in his relationship with the state because he loves South Dakota as a state. It's beautiful, right? You know, these wheat fields, these like listening to sunsets. It's a gorgeous place. And I think he just struggled with the fact that his home state would never really love him back the way that he loved it. And I think a lot of queer people understand that well, like being from places that you love, but will never love you back. And I don't know if there's like a solution to this as much as that you can see the difference in kids who don't have to deal with this, right? A great example is Clint in Illinois. That's our Muslim Pakistani kid. He seems to be quite popular at school, or at least well liked. He would never say that himself because he's just so like stubborn and independent. But he has like, you know, he was on the boys swim team. He seemed to have a lot of friends, and everything was just kind of like going well for him. And so well that he never really had to think about being trans. And he always said that he doesn't really want to either. Like his mission in life is to be known as a boy. You know, it's not to be known as a trans boy, because it's not how he thinks about himself. He just thinks about himself as a boy, like all other boys. And because he lives in Illinois, this state that has so many laws and protections in place for him, where, you know, he goes to a school that is pretty progressive and has progressive policies in place that allow him to be himself. It took all those burdens off of him, and he could just live his life the way that he wanted to live it and not have to worry about all this other stuff. And I think that's really what these kids want. That being a kid is hard enough as it is, you know, especially if you're like one of these kids that does feel like an outsider in your community. But if there are these layers of policies that are seeking to eradicate your right to exist, or don't make it possible to be yourself, it just makes that burden even harder. So for all these kids, I think what I want is for them to not have to fight so hard. Like they're always like, as I mentioned before, they're always down at their legislatures, like trying to like change hearts and minds, and to be a good example, like testifying before the legislature. They're meeting before school boards. They're, you know, forming their own organizations. They're leading pride parades at like 15 years old, and we're all so in debt to that work. It's incredible, like life-giving work, like they're saving lives, but they shouldn't have to do that at 15. They should just get to exist and have lovely lives.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up Clint because both Clint and Ruby, and I think you do this so beautifully in the book as well, this transcendence of the label of trans, because these kids are so much more than that. And in Clint and Ruby's case in particular, their faith also plays a significant role in their lives. For Ruby, her church actually held a renaming ceremony to celebrate their true identity. I was just curious, what are some of the other things, because the theme is joy. What were some of the other stories that, you know, that kind of stuck out to you where these faith and other things really brought those kids joy and connection and belonging in that area of isolation? So for Clint and Ruby, it's, you know, their faith definitely had something to do with it. Are there some others?
Yeah, I think it's about how these kids find community, right? That community is so important to all of us, right? And community can look like a lot of different things. It can be your church, it can be your family, it can be the place you live. But if you're trans, sometimes it's not always a given that you have those kinds of resources in the same way that everybody else does. It can be harder. I think that we sometimes paint with too broad a brush, and we sometimes send the message that like, oh, if you're trans, everybody must hate you or something. And that's not true, right? There's so many like churches and congregations and faith traditions that affirm and love queer people. And I was really proud to get to represent that in this book. With Ruby's story, you know, Ruby is she was raised Episcopalian. And when she came out, her church, as Britta mentioned, threw a renaming liturgy for her, which is basically just a big coming out party, right? Like she goes up, she gives a speech, and there was like cake or something. And it sent a message to her, or rather reminded her that she'd been loved as she was her entire life. her parents had been preparing for this for a long time. They sensed that something was up with Ruby when she was very young, that maybe she would grow up to be gay, that maybe she would be trans. They weren't sure, but they sensed that there was just something, a little something there. And if that day came, they wanted to be prepared for it, right? They wanted to feel like they had the resources in place. So they did the work, right? And like her church did the work, and everybody was so affirming and accepting and just cool. Like her, I was so lucky with this chapter because when I flew down to Texas to hang out with their family for 2.5 weeks, she got asked out by the boy she likes. And he's so cool that he let me like represent the whole thing. It's all in the book, so you get to read all about it. But there was never a moment in their relationship where she really had to worry all that much about not being affirmed by her boyfriend, because he just kind of got it like right away. She told him via text message, and it's the funniest thing. He left her unread, which is a jerk thing to do. And then he did, you know, the thing with the 3 dots when someone's typing? He did that, and it was just like typing for like 2 minutes, and she's like, oh my God, I've ruined it. I've ruined the whole thing. But it was because he was calling his friend to ask the best way to tell her that it didn't matter to him. So, and that's just not a moment that I think a lot of trans kids see represented that often in media. It's maybe a moment that they get in their lives, maybe not as often as we all would like, but that does happen. Like people fall in love, they have relationships, they get married, they have families, but we don't always see that. And I love just getting to tell the story of community that loves and affirms this girl, and not just like that all around her. Like her parents compared their lives to Schitt's Creek, which is a Netflix show about a fictional Canadian town where there's no homophobia and no transphobia, right? And it was just cool that this girl gets this. I was just so like glad to know that a person has that. But you see that in lots of other ways, like Ridian in Alabama. He is a Puerto Rican trans boy, very popular. He's probably the most popular kid at his school, though he'd never say that. I did, and he like got very embarrassed. And he goes to this like all queer school basically in Alabama. And I loved getting to write about that because as somebody who grew up a little bit in the South, you can sometimes tell from my mind. I think that we have so many stereotypes about Southerners that like they all just hate queer people and trans people, and they're like bigoted and rednecks and all this stuff. But it's like there are incredibly progressive queer people in the South. There are incredibly progressive cis people in the South and straight people. There are people who are doing amazing activism. If you want to meet like an activist really doing the work, talk to somebody from the South because they have to do it even harder, right? And here, in that sometimes oppressive environment, you had this kid who experiences this kind of like utopia where when you walk around the school with him all the time, all these kids have this like fabulously like rainbow hair in all these different shades. In one of the early drafts of the book, my editor told me I had to stop writing so much hair into the book because I was just so like involved, so that's part of it. But I was so enamored with everyone's hair because it's like that's pink hair and there's blue hair and there's purple hair. There's every shade, like every like hair shape you could think of. It was like going to a beautiful dog show. I just loved it so much, and I was just so enraptured by this, and that this kid gets this because so many queer kids don't. And I think it's the kind of school everybody would have loved to have gone to. Like, who doesn't want that level of fabulousness in their life? But for Ridian, it had made such a big difference because his last school wasn't like that. It was the kind of place where he got bullied in the hallway, where people would punch him on the way to class and the teacher would see it and they wouldn't even intervene, right? Where when he went to homecoming, he was so worried that something might happen to him that he basically spent the entire time hyperventilating in the corner. So it's like when kids have these kinds of resources in these spaces, they thrive. You get to see how much Ruby thrives because she has had that kind of space her entire life. You get to see how much of a difference it's made in Ridian's life when he gets to have that. He gets to be this cool, popular kid that everyone loves. He comes out of his shell. He's so like confident and assured in a way that he never was before. And I think we just ask ourselves, or we should ask ourselves, how do we make sure that kids get that kind of space? Whether, maybe they don't have it at school, right? But they have a local community center where they know they can go. They've got a church where they can go. They've got some place that they know they can go, maybe not every day, maybe not even every week, but when they really need it, where they can feel seen. Because so many of these kids really need that right now. You look at everything happening with a certain election coming up. And things are just getting really dire, and these kids are really, really feeling it. They know that they're like, that they know what's happening, and they know that they are being politicized for the gain of certain politicians. And with that, they just need like any kind of support that we can offer, because, it's always hard to be a kid. It's never been harder than right
I agree with that. And I also, I just wanna, in the book, I wanna just mention Micah as well, from West Virginia, because Micah's story touches on all those things as well, but there's another layer of complexity. Micah's of color, and that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the discussion. And we just talked about the, access to resources and finding that community, and it makes it even that much harder for, I think there's a whole other level for that as well. Speaking of politics, I'm so glad you brought that up. It is an election year, and we had to, I know we wanted to focus on joy, and we will get there, I promise, but I do wanna, talking about Micah, living in a state where gender-affirming care is not welcomed. But I also wanna talk, one of the things about this book is it's very relatable, and Nico does an amazing job telling just human stories, not trans stories, but human stories. There's so much relatable stories about just love and being a family and belonging. What I did notice is there's a lot of support and love from the parents and the moms in particular. We have some activist moms in that book as well. So Molly, Ruby's mother, and Janet, Kylie's mother. And one thing that stuck out to me is a quote. I just want to read this to you. That's from from Ruby's mother, Molly, talking about politics. If they, meaning the lawmakers, knew the length we went to save our kids, no one would accuse us of abusing our children. And it's really something, that quote, that really stuck with me. And it's these powerful moments between private conversations in the family and that kind of activism. How much do you see that actually reflected, especially in those kids with the very active moms, how that contributes to their resilience and their joy in their lives? And I noticed also I think it's Ruby's family, we have a wall of a gratitude wall.
Yeah.
So they have a gratitude wall, and they have it to remind themselves that their happiness is not dependent on the Texas lawmakers, but how does that affect them, that activism and that kind of finding that resilience for them? I know there's different stories for Kylie and
Yeah. Well, actually, I'll start with Kylie and Clint, because I do think it can be like a little bit of a double-edged sword in a way. That, like, obviously the parental support and affirmation is so critical for kids. So I really don't want to take that for granted, and I don't want to be callous about this. Like, if given the choice, everybody wants a supportive parent. Everybody wants like a mother or a father or a parent who loves them as they are, who sees them as who they are, and also allows them to like live their life the way they know it best, who doesn't try to force them into a box. I have a little bit of experience of that with my own family, and it's hard, right? All you want is to just be yourself, and you have these people who are telling you that that isn't okay. So, and it's tough. So for these kids who do get that, it's life-giving, it's world-changing. But I think it can be hard sometimes when your like parents are doing all of this activism, because you maybe feel like you have to do it too, right? And there's sort of this implicit pressure there that I think a lot of these kids feel to like be activists and advocates and be out there like fighting for their rights all the time. But it was so fascinating to me, because the one thing that almost all these kids said universally is that they don't want to do this. Like, they don't want to do this with their time. A lot of them didn't even really want to be in the book. They did it because it's important, and it needed to be done. And there was a purpose to it, but it's not the way they'd like to spend their time. Like Kylie, our California girl, she just wanted to be enjoying her summer. She we didn't have any, she wouldn't really like open up to me or really work with me until I took her to see a Jennifer Lawrence movie. Thank God for Jennifer Lawrence. If I ever have the chance to repay her, I will in some way. She has a lot of money, so I can't do it in that way, but some other way, I'll give her a hug. But I think she just got so caught up in the fact that she just wanted to be having a typical summer, and here she is forced to hang out with this journalist, right? And as one of the team said in an op-ed for Teen Vogue, Like, he never should have been forced to have a journalist follow him around for 2.5 weeks in order to convince people to treat him like a person, right? It's a sad thing to have to do. Like, I'm grateful to have done it. I'm grateful to know these kids, but none of them should be doing this with their time. And they've been doing this for such a long time. They've been being advocates and activists pretty much their entire lives. Like, Wyatt says pretty eloquently in the book that he feels like he had to sacrifice his childhood in order to fight for the rights, not only his own rights, but the rights of other trans teens. And it's really interesting because he and I are really close. We talk a lot. I mean, he texts me a lot because I think we're kind of the same. He reminds me a lot of where I was when I was 17. He recently told me that he started listening to the band My Bloody Valentine, which is this really great shoegaze band. And I said, great, you are perfectly on track to dye your hair black and to have a very ill-fated love affair with Self-Tanner. And I was like, if anybody gives you an orange bottle, just run. It's bad. Don't do it. But if he's going to a party with his friends on the weekend, he'll sometimes ask me permission to go. And I'm like, well, you should be asking your mom. I'm not Susan, so maybe ask her. But really what he's looking for is permission to be a kid, right? To have these kid experiences, because he just doesn't know how to do that, because he's never really gotten that chance or that opportunity to be a child, because he's had to have all these adult problems his whole life. And I think that's what so many of these kids are searching for, which is how to be a kid amid all this stuff, right? And it's so ironic because all of these Republican lawmakers, let's just say that they're always Republicans, are saying that they are fighting, we just want kids to be kids, leave the kids alone and all this stuff. And it's so ironic to me because that's exactly what these kids are fighting for. They just want to be kids, but they want to be kids on their own terms. They want to be the kind of kid they want to be, not the kind of kid that somebody who doesn't even know them wants them to be. So I think that was really the thing that I hope to express with this. But I think that you can also see just what a benefit it is to just have parents who love you and get you, because it's one less thing you're fighting. You're fighting all these other battles too. But imagine fighting your own family on top of that. We had this publisher who turned us down because they said that the book wasn't realistic because there were no families that rejected their kids, right? Which was nuts to me. But so glad we didn't go with them. But no family was like that was going to let us write about them. That was never going to happen in a billion years. They're not going to let me follow them around for 2.5 weeks to be like, you're bad parents. Like what? No. But then on top of that, trans kids already know that story, right? They hear it every day. Maybe they hear it from their own families, right? That rejection. Maybe they hear about their friends being rejected. I wanted to tell them that hope is out there. There's joy out there. There are people who are going to love them and support them for exactly who they are. And that's the message I feel like we need to be telling people right now. Rather than just reaffirming that same heartache over and over again. I didn't want to tell kids something they already knew. I wanted to tell them maybe something they needed to hear.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Because then again, I know there's parents in the audience. Many parents might wonder, especially there's kids that, in 6th and 7th grade start questioning, and they may wonder, is this a genuine expression of who who my child is? What comes to mind is Janet, who's Kylie's mom, who I kind of read like a Gen Xer. Is she a Gen Xer?
I don't think she'd be comfortable with me disclosing.
Okay, anyway, I just read her
very young.
Well, she said, she's obsessed with you write about her that she's obsessed with the idea of making the right choices for her daughter, right? And it kind of brought me to the question, but parents might wonder is this just a trend or is this a genuine, expression? And what advice would you give to parents? Where can they go and find resources when they are unsure, but they want to be supportive or they are confused and how to do this? Yeah. And on the flip side, while I have the mic, okay. What advice would you give to teens that are struggling and trying to figure all of that out?
Yeah, I would just say give your kids space. Maybe they do just want time to figure this out and explore this for themselves. It's I feel like so much of being a kid is trying on these different hats and seeing which hat looks the best on you. It's kind of a process of trial and error. So if you do have a kid who's just like questioning their gender, just like love them and support them. Like it's a very like yes and process of like, if your kid is doing this, you're like, okay, yes, and then how can I support you in this? Like, you want to try on a dress, how do we get you that dress? As long as you know it's within the budget, of course, and not asking anyone to break the bank. None of these kids are getting Oscar de la Renta, you know, they'll get the knockoff, Oscar de la Renta or something. And I think it really just comes down to that, like love your kids in the best way, you know, how, like see them for the possibilities, you know, that one of the really special things about being a kid, it is this time to just kind of like play and have fun, and experiment with things while the stakes are a lot lower, you know, because you're not an adult yet, like everything's not like finished for you. But sometimes like as a 36-year-old person, I feel like a lot of like those, it's how do you say? All right, here's a good way to put it. I used to be really obsessed with this Sylvia Plath poem that was about all these apples on this tree. And she felt like she would reach for an apple and then it would fall down. And those like apples represented possibility, right? And as you get older and older, all those possibilities kind of start going away, right? That there are just fewer of them. I don't think that's totally true. I think I have a lot of possibilities. Thank you. But it does feel like that sometimes, right? That things are a little more rooted, a little more set. But when you're a kid, there's still so many apples, right? Like the world is just endless for you. So I would just recommend to parents, like, don't limit that world for these kids. Like, let them reach for whatever apple they want. And like, whatever apple they happen to pick, just love that apple. It's a beautiful apple. It's delicious. I bet it tastes great, you know? And I think that that's all you can do. And for kids, I would just say, listen to yourself. Like, you know yourself best. You know yourself better than anybody else in the world. So like whatever your heart's journey is and whoever you decide you want to be, that's great. And whatever anybody else's opinion on that, like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as much as you like living your truth the only way that you know how. Like it's there's this quote that Clint says, I'm gonna get it right. He said, it's everyone's own life. You've got to live it the way you want to.
We're getting close to time and I want to make sure people can ask questions, but just maybe in a couple sentences, and it's a very cliche question, but I have to ask it, but I'm going to make it a nuanced one. What do you want readers to take away from your book? And more specifically, what do you think cisgender readers can learn from the stories of those transgender kids?
It's so simple. And I always say that I think this is a really depressing thesis for a book to have in 2024. Like this book should not exist. It should not have to exist. Like I shouldn't have to explain to people that trans kids are kids and that they're human and they deserve to be treated like humans. But that's what the book is. That's what it's about. Like we somehow in our political discourse right now have missed that these kids are humans and they want the same things that all humans want. They want to be loved, they want to be desired, they want to be affirmed for the person that they are. And I think it's important to see that sameness. But, excuse me, I'm soda water, you know? But I also hope we don't insist too much on that like sameness. That these kids taught me a lot in that what they're fighting for isn't to be seen as the same as everyone else. It's to get to be their own person. It's to get to be different. There was this sort of mantra in the LGBTQ plus movement in the like mid 2000s of like, you know, same love, right? During the marriage equality fight, that like our relationships are the same as yours. Like love is love, like we're just like you. And I think that was at the time important, right? Because it helped get us marriage equality. It helped couples across the country, you know, have the kinds of relationships and the marriages that they want. So I don't want to like dismiss that, but I don't want to have to be the same as everybody else to have rights. You know, I should get to have rights because I am a person, because I'm an American, because in being an American, have the same like constitutional protections that everybody else does. And so much of what these kids are expressing is that they deserve that too. They deserve to get to be the ability to be themselves and for other people to respect that. And we've gotten to this point in our country right now. I don't know how we've things have gotten like this, but we're so uncomfortable with difference. We're so uncomfortable with other people not having the same kind of life that we do or making the same kind of choices that we do. So for those cis readers, I hope that you see yourself in these kids. I hope you see yourself in these families. That maybe they remind you of you, maybe they seem like your kid or like your friend's kid, right? That there is that recognition there. But if there's not, don't use it as an excuse to take these kids' rights away. If you don't see yourself in them, if this book doesn't answer any questions you have, that doesn't mean that these kids' lives aren't valid. It just means that they're different than you. And we just need to let that be okay. And so that's my message for cis people. My message for trans people is really just this. Keep fighting. This world needs you here. It needs you to exist. There is, this slogan, Make America Great Again, that a certain person really loves, and is now used twice. And then Make America Great Again. It's like Veep or something, it's wild. And that phrase is really interesting to me because it seems to suggest that some people aren't Americans, right? That some people aren't part of that project of America, that in order to make America great again and again and again, you then have to eradicate certain people. Certain people need to not exist anymore. And for trans kids, I just want to remind them, you're what makes America great. It's not great in spite of you, it's great because of you. So if you've got trans kids in your life or trans people in your life, just please remind them of that it's them that makes this country great.
That was a beautiful note to end on. I'm hoping there are some questions in the audience because Nico's, if you have something.
Can I say one tiny thing?
I don't know. I think I can give you those.
It'll take 1 minute. So when we were starting the book tour for this, our PR person, who I think meant well, always taught me to have or told me to have low expectations from my Q&As. She's like, you're gonna do all these events, maybe 3 people will come and 1 of them will buy a book. And I've never had low expectations in my entire life. I will not start now. And I will just remind everybody that I am so glad to be here connecting with you all, because this is the good part, right? You spend 2 years in isolation writing a book like this, and it's lonely and it's horrible sometimes, and it's just, you have so many edits, and you wonder if you'll ever get to the end, but then suddenly it comes out and you're among all these wonderful people, and I'm so grateful to be here. But also please remember, I'm here to sell a book, so I hope you buy it, please. Our PR person told me it's the average is 30% of audience members buy a book. And it's if only 30% of people buy a book, they will have to bury me on site. So if you do not want to personally get out a shovel tonight and bury me at this middle school.
It's dangerous to be buried here, just so you know.
But if you do not want to be part of that this evening, then please buy a book. If we run out of those books in the back with the bookstore, then you can buy them online through Barnes and Noble. There's also Outstore, which is a great LGBTQ+ vendor. There's queer Amazon, but way less problematic, I promise. And there are also great independent bookstores across the country. There's so many opportunities to support this book. And my ask is really just this, just please, these kids need us. And I think the smallest thing we can possibly do is just buy a freaking book. So, and I thank you for that. And I apologize, I will never do this again.
Thank you, then I don't have to.
Yeah.
You just did that much better than I could have. Are there any questions?
I was wondering about Ruby in Alabama. You said that the school was all queer, and I was wondering if that was on purpose. Is that the way Alabama is dealing with trans kids?
No, it's not
Let me
this.
just repeat the question for the recording. So there was a question about Ruby's school in Alabama, the all queer school, and if this was on purpose,
Yeah.
you were asking?
Yeah, it's not the state of Alabama. It's a charter school that was created by Birmingham AIDS Outreach in order to give LGBTQ kids a safe space. And it's sort of LGBT plus affirming, but it's not like, it would be literally illegal for them to not let like straight cis kids go there. So what they've done is it's kind of a safe space for a lot of kids who have faced like bullying or rejection or like harassment or way worse in their previous environments. So you end up with actually a lot of like Latina kids there, who went through just like horrible racism in their previous schools and just didn't have anywhere to go where they could like just learn, right? Because you bring all this trauma with you to school every day, it can be really hard to just focus on class, right? Like it really impedes like your ability to get good grades and to graduate on time and reach all these milestones. So you see all of these kids who had challenges in their previous environments in a lot of different ways. Some kids are like neurodivergent or learn differently. And the school is just a place where they don't have to worry that someone's gonna hate them for who they are. So like, it's definitely like the affirming queer kids is like central to the project, but it's not the entire thing. So don't worry, Alabama's not segregating queer kids, I promise.
It just seemed a little strange to me, but I was also wondering, do you find that same solution in other states? And does it tend to be mostly conservative states that we found?
There are only 2 schools like it in the entire country right now. Right now they're working on Miss Major Middle School, which would be an explicitly LGBTQ affirming school in New York for the middle grades. That has not happened yet. They are still waiting to be approved. But it's it's a similar situation there, that there are so many kids who don't feel safe in their schools who just need a place where they can learn and learn effectively. And the folks behind that project I know are really passionate about it and really want it to happen. So I hope they get their charter. Like fingers crossed for them. Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question.
Any other questions? Also, while you're thinking about the next question to ask, please fill out the surveys for the library. It's really important to them to get feedback on these kinds of events.
You can tell them how amazing this was. Yes.
2 questions actually. One is, I would imagine that there's a lot of mental health issues amongst these people that you've spoken with families, having encountered so much isolation and everything else. So I'm curious, how they spoke about it, how it impacted you, and also how you cope with all of this and the writing process and then going forward. And it sounds like you're planning to stay in touch with these people, they become your families all across the country, but is that the norm for you?
Sure. Yeah. So basically this question about mental health, like how it affects like these kids' lives, the issue of mental health. But then also essentially how it affects my mental health to do this work. And the answer, oh my God, I'm starting to laugh at this. It's just been like such a whole thing in my life. So this is so silly and this is gonna make me sound really dorky. But when I used to go to the doctor, I would always get compliments on my blood pressure. And I was really smug about it. So whenever I would come home, like to my husband, who did not care about this, I would be like, the doctor said I have great blood pressure again today. He said I'll live to be 100. And I'm like, I don't know who I was like bragging for the benefit of, but I just took a weird level of pride in my blood pressure. But when I got done with this book, I went to the doctor because I was just feeling like crap, just really not good. And they put the little cuff on and it said 160 over 100. Which if you're unfamiliar, that's really bad. That's like a D- in blood pressure. They like legally weren't allowed to let me leave until my blood pressure went down. So I'm on good medication now. I take a lovely heart pill 2 times a day. Beta blockers, they're great, highly recommend. But I think it's a reminder of how much this stuff affects your body. Like you're experiencing a lot of vicarious trauma all the time. It's sort of my job as a journalist to experience vicarious trauma. Like I've been doing human rights reporting for a long time. So it's kind of like my whole life. I sometimes say that it's easier for me to talk about the worst thing that's ever happened to somebody than to just ask somebody how their like sports team did, which I'm sure they did well. So I affirm for all of you. But I just got used to it. But being in this space with these kids, you are hanging out in their vicarious trauma for such a long time that it really, really, really gets to you. And it was really hard on me. And I didn't have very good like coping mechanisms or like mental health practices writing this book, because I was honestly way in over my head. I'd never dealt with a level of trauma like this before. I'd never like been in such close quarters with folks who were going through it the way that they did. Like one day I got so stressed out that I washed my phone in the washing machine. And I put it through the rinse cycle, so I had no phone in rural West Virginia. And also, I thought it would be a really good idea to not bring my debit card because I was already attached to my phone, meaning that I also had no money in rural West Virginia. So it was very challenging. I had to go to Western Union. My parents had to wire me money. So all of that is really to say that this work is really hard, and we need to support journalists in doing it. There's a reason I bring this up, and it's not just because it makes for a darkly funny anecdote, but because journalists are doing this all the time. They're putting their bodies and their mental health on the line to like bring you the reporting that you see every day. So I just always ask people, like, do what you can to support journalists. We can't do this alone. Like, it's getting harder and harder to do it. There are fewer opportunities to do it. Like, I had to do this book because I haven't had a job for 3 years, a full-time job, and not to brag too much, but at the thing I do, I'm sort of like arguably the best person at it, and I can't find a job to do it. So I had to do this to have a job. I mean, I did it for lots of other reasons too, but it was also because like I wanted to keep doing my work. I wanted to do it in the way that I wanted to do it. So I had to find a new way. So if you have the ability to subscribe to somebody's Substack, right, to follow them on Twitter or not Twitter, follow them on Instagram. Twitter's dead now. Yeah, don't give Elon Musk anything. But just do what you can because we need your help. But I will also say that I was a little bit of a tourist in these folks' trauma, right? I got to show up for 2.5 weeks, experience it with these folks, and then leave, right? I get to like go to a therapist and then unpack it and leave it all behind. Imagine what this is doing to these folks all the time. If you can't escape this, if it's like, if this is your home state, these are your lawmakers who are doing this to you. These are your local community members who are doing this to you. Like, just imagine the impact on your body if you can't leave that trauma behind. Imagine what your blood pressure might look like. I have a friend of mine who's a mom of a trans kid. She went in a couple of years ago. I think it was like 200 over 100. And they had to like have a very serious health plan to make sure that she would be okay. But it's just a reminder of the burden that these folks are taking on all the time. And it just shouldn't happen. Like, this is supposed to be America, right? We're supposed to be the greatest country in the world. And this is the level of stress that some like families of trans kids are being put through just to survive. Like, that's not okay. And I just want to take a moment to just affirm that, like, it's not okay. Thank you for the question.
I think I want to be mindful of the time. We want to sell some books and we have Nico here to sign them as well. So you will sign them, right?
I will